Hello, and welcome to the How I Tested That podcast. I'm your host, David J. Bland. I'm an author and advisor, and I'm fascinated with testing early stage ideas. I've helped companies all around the world, and in this podcast, I connect with entrepreneurs and innovators who had the courage to test their ideas with real people in the market, with sometimes surprising results. Please join us as we explore the ups and downs of experimentation together. In this episode, we interviewed J.L. Heather. He's the managing partner at Centered. Centered empowers organizations to innovate by fostering a culture of experimentation. JL and I explore the intricacies of innovation, design sprints, and the importance of leadership in fostering a culture of creativity and experimentation. We discuss the challenges of making innovation stick, the role of customer feedback, and the significance of using the right language to engage teams and leaders. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, JL.
Awesome. Thanks, David. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. You have such a great background as far as testing and helping companies test and, with agile and design sprints and all that. I would love for people to learn a little bit about you before we jump into some of your testing stories.
This is probably the thing I'm the worst talking about is about myself, but I'll give it my best shot. Maybe the first thing to know about me is I grew up I grew up as like a hardcore introvert. Computers made sense to me. People didn't. It wasn't really until, I entered the professional world, maybe a little bit in high school when I did debate, that I started to kind of figure people out. That led me down this path from software engineering to running projects to helping organizations figure out better ways to work that maybe weren't quite so hard on their people, which that's where I kind of fell in love with lean, agile, human-centered design thinking type of practices. And then I spent like 15 years in the agency world where I worked with like Walmart, Wendy's, Pfizer, Sprint, which is now T-Mobile. I mean, the list goes on. I could list all the big companies. And I could just kind of figure out that at some point you have a decision to make. You either keep doing what other people are asking you to do, or you decide to go out and do the thing you really want to do. So about a year and a half ago, when VML and I parted ways, me and my business partner kind of dove into Centered, which had been a side business, and made it our real business. And we decided that the best thing we could do is to help organizations find ways to make innovation not an event, but a culture, not a meeting, but part of their DNA. And we've been having a blast since.
That's such an interesting journey. I think I could share the introvert part of that. Because
I think a lot of people can, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely kind of stick to myself, which people would find surprising because, when you're on stage talking to thousands of people, they're like, oh, you must be an extrovert. I was like, no, that's...
My cup is empty by the end of that.
Yes. I remember my first keynote, I think I just went back to my hotel and just like laid across my bed and just stared at the hotel ceiling and just like, what am I doing? Like, why did I do that? Why do I keep doing this to myself? So I can definitely relate to that. And I mean, I like that blending of how do we make things stick with different methodologies? Maybe, talk a little bit how you approach things, what kind of challenges you see when you go into organizations and you're trying to get them to go beyond just, oh yeah, that workshop was great. And let's go back to exactly how we were working before.
Yeah. There's a couple of things you're talking about there. Like one is that how do you make it stick? Which I think actually comes a little bit later. You have the workshop, the event, the thing you do, and you want it to have impact and value. And when it does, that's great. But then there's a few time horizons after that you really kind of have to think about. And maybe the first one that's really important is the maybe 2 to 4 week momentum drop. So great workshop happens, innovation goes on, everyone's super excited. 2 weeks after that, it's kind of crickets. And I think if you want to get to the part where you can make some changes stick on the cultural level or the organizational level, the first hurdle you have to get over is that momentum hurdle. And I think that's really where marketing comes in. And I don't mean marketing to your customers, I mean marketing internally. How do you take what you did and turn it into a story that people care about, that people want to be involved in, and that matters enough that someone with decision-making power is going to say, if they haven't already, we're going to put money where our mouth is on this, and we're going to actually change the way we do things a little bit to make this happen. And then if you can do that, you have that next step of proving it. So like what we end up doing, we'll run a design sprint, we'll help market that, And hopefully we turn that into something where there's a team that can execute on the results of that design sprint and start iterating and testing as we go. That's the next proof point. And that's the thing that you can start pulling in like, hey, look, here's the culture thing. Here's what you can do. Here's how you might make this work with other teams. So I think if you can jump that momentum gap in the 2 to 4 week range, you can really start looking at how can we actually start affecting culture, because now we have sustained attention, we have sustained dollars. And once you're there, there's a lot of different things you can do in terms of like bringing in stakeholders, making sure that you cycle through some extra people to understand kind of what's going on. Again, marketing what you're doing, all these different things. But jump the momentum gap, demonstrate some success in execution, and show that the innovation didn't stop with the one big event, but that it's actually part of the way that team executes.
I like how you frame that. I think so much we hear about like create a sense of urgency, urgency. And I think in where I'm leaning towards now is, like you said, momentum. If everything's urgent, nothing's urgent. So sometimes it can be really hard to create a sense of urgency, but if you can create momentum, then that is something you can build upon. And I think, one of my first big clients in San Francisco, I don't know if they were completely transparent from a leadership level of what was going on when I was in there, because I remember doing a sprint and about halfway through the team looks at us and they say, "We're not going to go back to working the way we used to, are we?" And I was kind of like, "No, you're not. I wish that was communicated better to you at the time." And my co-author, Alex Osterwalder, he sees that sometimes where they'll bring him in and the team at some point will be like, "Wait, we're not working like we used to before?" And so I do think maybe it's a situation where leaders feel like they're just being repetitive, or they don't want to keep repeating the message over and over again. But I do think there is something about the repetition of leadership explaining the why, and no, this is going to be different going forward. And I don't know, do you experience that as well, where leaders almost have a hard time communicating to their teams that things are going to change and we are going to try to do things differently beyond the workshop?
So one, like you mentioned some of what you're talking about in terms of like, we have to go back to the old way of working. Just real quick on that, like one of our first design sprints we did with HP a number of months ago now, when we came out of that, we were hearing things like this is the most impactful workshop we've done. Some of them were saying like in our career, it went really, really well. And we heard a lot of that, like now at the end of it, like, wait a minute, now we have to go back. So I do think that is a common refrain. And it points to a whole different problem that we could probably discuss later. But it is interesting to me to hear people, once they're exposed to a different way of working, a different way of looking at a problem, how that becomes compelling enough that they want to do more. I mean, how often do you see people at work go, "Oh man, I want to go to another meeting"? Like that doesn't seem to happen very often, but with these, it kind of does. In terms of leadership, I think one of the, to go back to something I said earlier about marketing, a good idea is not enough. Data and testing is not enough. If you can't tell a compelling story, no matter what else you do, you're not going to go very far in a large organization, especially. And one of the best things you can start training people on is, the overarching term is market internally, but really like help arm their leadership with the information they need to tell the story, whether it's about the thing you built or the process you followed. So again, like HP, we're working within their Insights to Innovation program, which is, I think, something that's owned by Wayante San Martin and her team. But the idea there is at every point, they want to show how the training, the process has made a difference. So when we did that first design sprint that went really well with them, not only did that lead to a really great product discussion, but all of a sudden now that Insights to Innovation program could market that success of a way of working. And I think when you're looking to really drive change within an organization, you have to be able to market that success. You have to be able to explain, to kind of steal a little bit from Simon Sinek, you have to explain the why, right? You have to start with the why. And maybe that's where the next mistake leaders make comes in. The why they think is singular. And it's not. There's 100 of them. There's an infinite number of whys. There's the why for that leader. There's the why for that organization. There's the why for department X and team Y and this individual and that individual. So what you have to arm the leaders with is some ways to cast a very broad net of why that's backed up by success and momentum so they can actually talk the talk. If all you do is give them the results, sure, that sounds great. It looks good. The needles on some of their KPIs move. But if they aren't talking about the why, it's not going to stick. It's going to go back into business as usual, because what you're doing is you're feeding business as usual. So you got to find a way to create a narrative that is a little bit outside that business as usual concept.
Yeah, we had Aaron Schlesinger from HP on earlier, and I've done some work with HP in the past, and I do think they're a pretty innovative company, in general, of how they approach things. I think any way they can get out and talk more about that is needed, because there's a lot of cool stuff going on inside HP, so I'm glad you're a part of that. The aspect here of leadership, I do think I keep coming back to it, because I notice the teams figure this stuff out. Yes, they could always use some more thinking tools and new ways of working and new experiments to run that they've maybe not experienced before or aren't well versed in. I see a lot of teams stick with interviews and surveys, and they don't do any kind of paper prototyping or clickable prototypes, depending on the industry and all that. And yet, it all does come back to leadership, in the sense of, if they're not on board, if they're not supporting this, giving space for this, making sure that the teams understand how this is connected to where they're going as a company and why this is important, it'll plateau and fizzle out. I think I made some sort of meme on LinkedIn a while back where I drew these J curves, and the J's just kept going down. It's like a J curve. And then the next curve starts in the middle of that dip of the J and goes down again and down again, down again. And so I do think there's an element of bringing on leadership as well. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, when you're talking about, experimentation and such and assumptions, how are those conversations with leadership? Are you using those words? Or are you using other words that they're more used to? How does your brain work when you go into that conversation?
No, I love that question. I think we love to talk about experiments. It's a really useful word, because if you say something like, we're going to try, people are like, no, we don't try, we just do. That doesn't seem to work. When you start talking about, there's a risk of failure, people are, no, we don't fail, right? Like that's a bad word in a lot of big organizations. When you start saying, like, we're going to look into this, what's the time frame? But when you say we're going to run an experiment, it starts to talk about something where there's learning at its heart, because by definition, you don't run an experiment unless you want to learn something. It's typically time bound. So, if you're going to try something, who knows? But if you're going to run an experiment, you're going to do something and you're going to check the results. So it feels time bound. It also feels different enough from the way businesses usually talk about how they work that it starts to stand out a little bit. So I really love the word experiment because of all those reasons. And at the heart of a design sprint, that's really what a design sprint is. You come in with a hypothesis that you typically represent as a how might we statement of some kind. And then you can run your experiment and then you can have your results. So if that's all you do, that by itself is valuable. So when we talk to leaders about it, we do talk about experiments. Sometimes we will talk about a hypothesis, but more often than not, we frame it as a challenge statement or an opportunity statement. I think hypothesis somehow just kind of crosses the line into not relatable enough for some reason. But when you start talking about a challenge statement, that sounds interesting, right? Or an opportunity or something. We even kind of move away from how might we outside of the meeting, like with leadership, because how might we feels too vague. Challenge or opportunity, like that's what they want. We got to solve this challenge, or we got to realize this opportunity. And then in terms of results, once we've run it, we kind of, not to harp on it too much, but we really do turn it into a marketing exercise at the end. But what we try and tell them is, look, no one ever created anything amazing with just one experiment. If you truly want to disrupt, which everyone wants to disrupt, or if you want to do something that is game changing, it's going to take multiple experiments. So a lot of times what we say up front is, before you even start talking about the experiment you want to run, let's talk about I wonder how to expand the metaphor from experiment, but let's talk about what's the realm of possible for this group. And typically the goal is to come up with 3 to 5 experiments that they'd like to try. And I think the reason we do that, and we do that at the very beginning, is because it really starts to instill the mindset that this isn't about one and done. This is about creating a iterative cycle of experimentation that continually elevates the team and the product. So while experiment works, hypothesis not as much, like that's a great conversation to have. I think the first conversation you have to have is about process, the lab that they're going into. So that's something new we're talking about is our breakthrough lab. The idea is not just one thing, but it's a lab where you continue to experiment to develop something really awesome. And I feel like now I've gotten myself far enough away from your question that I can't remember exactly what it was. But I do love the word experiment. We stay a little bit away from hypothesis. Outside of that, we really try and adopt the language of the organization. That way, we're not trying to swim upstream.
I think you answered the question really well. I think the words matter,
Absolutely, yeah.
I get asked a lot, because I use this little 2x2 for framing risk, and it's called assumptions mapping. And people are like, why don't you call that a hypothesis mapping? And I said, because it doesn't sound as good.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I don't call it that. And I also realized that, sometimes people are more open to talk about assumptions, but even that is tough conversation, and when you layer on too much of the scientific jargon on top of people, unless they have a really strong base in scientific method. Like sometimes I'm working with people that are like Nobel laureates and they have, all these patents and they're very steeped in scientific method. I can use that language with them because they get it.
Their lexicon already, right? So
So I can use that with them and say, oh, we're just using this in a different context. Like when I'm working with Toyota, it's like, you're already great at lean manufacturing, but we're going to do this thing like lean startup. It's kind of the same principles, but we're doing it in a very different context. So it's still hard, but they can understand the words. But when I'm talking about assumptions, I can say, well, what would have to be true for this to work? What are the big assumptions we're making? And what I'm loving right now in the industry, I don't know if you're seeing this as well, but I keep using this framing of desirable, viable, feasible, which I picked up in design thinking, but I use it to frame risk. And it's so refreshing to see, someone in the C-suite stand up in front of their team or stand up in front of the company and use those words of, these are the kinds of things that we need to care about. And we can't just focus on feasibility because, if the need's not there or they won't pay enough, we'll still fail. And so I really like that framing. Do you see that framing used in your work, or, what kind of words are leaders using when they're talking about, risk in your world?
Man, that varies wildly. One, I'm a huge fan of desirable, viable, and feasible. I think it maps so well to so many things. Risk, there's a lot of overlap between that and agile. For instance, one of the things we do a lot when we talk about roles in agile is we say, you have roles specific to what's viable, what's desirable, and what's feasible. Your technology team is in the feasible camp. Your viable and desirable are like your PO and your analyst and some things like that. And the goal is to create some tension between all three of those areas so you kind of land in a healthy middle. So I think that conversation is really interesting. And I think when you look at it from a risk perspective, I haven't ever tried to apply that to risk. I think when I hear people talk about risk, the concept that comes up most often is some form of jobs to be done. So like Tony Ulwick, who we had a conversation with a while back, really great guy, this idea of where are we missing the mark with the humans that buy our product? What jobs do they have that they're trying to accomplish that they can't? Because that's where our risk lies. And how well are our competitors meeting those needs, fulfilling those jobs compared to how we do it? That's a really oversimplification of the whole process because you can get into all the emotional, social, functional jobs and all those different things that kind of go with it. But it becomes a really powerful way to evaluate risk. There's a tendency for people who are really big jobs to be done fans to apply it only to their customers, their external customers. But you can just as easily do it internally as well. You can do it from a business perspective. You can treat other organizations as customers. And it's just a really powerful way to shift mindsets around risk that I think becomes really healthy, and it humanizes the risk to some extent. I don't know how many people I hear doing that before we talk to them. I think a lot of times what you see in organizations is risk gets watered down in a lot of ways and is based on a lot of assumptions rather than data. And it's funny that you talk about assumptions. I think assumptions are a close cousin of biases, which makes them really hard to deal with sometimes because people don't realize the assumptions they're making when they talk about risk, whatever that risk ends up being. I was going to try and come up with a really clever example, and that's not happening right at the moment. But I do think when people look at risk, like say risk from competition, like market share risk, that tends to be more fear-based, and things that you heard that you haven't even realized are affecting your decisions or your view of the risk. And when you can come up with something like jobs to be done theory to actually start breaking that down and making it something you can wrap your head around rather than just a feeling, that's a way to make those assumptions take a step back, or at least bring them out into the light. That's probably my biggest way to look at it. Let's look at the human aspect here. Let's talk about the jobs, whether they're internal, external, between us and another competitor, vendor, whatever. And let's break that down and let's talk about the risks associated with those jobs not being met.
Yeah, there's an interesting way to think of jobs to be done. And I know there are different camps of jobs to be done. I'm a fan of Tony's work and others. I think using it in a very practical way, I think sometimes we get too caught up in the tools themselves, and sometimes we lose the practicality of it all and how do we apply it day to day. So I like you tying it back to something people care about, like, risk, of course.
I think we have this problem with tools. So whether it's agile, jobs to be done, design thinking, we tend to only apply them in a narrow band. So I was taught to use jobs to be done to talk about products. I was taught to use design thinking to design products and services. I was taught to use agile to deliver. But the reality is, like, the best leaders are the ones that pick and choose and say, you know what, this is a really good opportunity, regardless of what's happening, to apply some jobs to be done theory. So I think when organizations are looking for new leaders, they're looking for support. One of the things they should look for is people with a wide breadth of experience in the space rather than depth. Don't go and hire a highly accredited Scrum Master to run your team. Hire someone with some breadth of knowledge who can help you pick and choose the right tools, the right processes to apply in that moment, because there's a lot of value outside of the narrow bands where some of these tools are talked about.
Yeah, I think most of the time I end up using a new tool. It's because what I'm using is not working.
Absolutely,
I get pulled into it. So we talked a lot about leadership, and I do think that's a good topic to explore. I also want to talk a little bit about some experiments. So we often interview people about, hey, how do you test something fun? And we've had everything on here from upcycled barley to dog showers to AI compliance products. We really don't stick in a specific sector. And I know you don't stick in a specific sector either, because you work with so many different types of companies. Are there any fun experiments you can share with us where you thought, we were trying to prototype something and test it, and anything fun that you can share with our listeners?
I won't say the company name. I'll try and keep this a little bit vague because it was fun. But what we were trying to do is figure out how we could remotely get measurements of someone's face to basically help produce a product that they would wear. So in the design sprint, what we ended up doing was we just went out and said, you know what? There's got to be something with our phone that we can just scan faces and get like a 3D map of it. And sure enough, there was. And it was one of the more fun afternoons because we spent an hour just scanning every single person's face we could get to, just with our phone wandering around, and then loading that into like CAD, which is one of we had a person there from a local university who was an AI expert, because you can't have a design sprint these days without an AI expert there. It's a new requirement. He was loading these maps up, and we were like placing the eyeballs behind there and all this other stuff and trying to see how accurate could we actually be. And it was really enlightening to show something that at first, when we talked about it, felt very complex. Like, how do you measure remotely someone's face to like a very small degree of error for fit? Like, how do you do that? To going to, well, you know what? We don't have to. We could potentially use some of these other tools to prove the concept. And in the course of like 2 hours, we had a working concept where we could say, look, just here in this room, we can now do this with a high degree of accuracy. We're not quite to where we need to be for manufacturing, but we're pretty darn close. That probably means that once we leave this room, the team that runs with this is going to be able to close that gap without a huge amount of work. And the number of times something like that happens is encouraging. Like, it gives me a little faith in the human race to some extent, that when we come together in a cross-functional, like diverse background, diverse ways of thinking, like group, we can almost always surprise ourselves by finding an easier way to solve a problem. I still have a 3D map of, I think it's my face. Maybe it was someone else's. I don't remember, with like the eyeballs behind it and everything. It's a little bit creepy, but it's really interesting just to see what's possible when you are more concerned about the outcome than who built it.
I love that story. Our first episode we actually had as a case study in the book was remote face measurement for glasses. And they did a lot of different testing to figure out, how to solve for that. Also, they had a lot of desirability risks because people had, glasses that didn't fit and they didn't know why they didn't fit and all that. So that was a fun first episode for us. But I agree. Like, I'm always really interested in tapping into people's creativity in this kind of work. Because I feel like it drives me nuts when I'm talking to people inside of a company and they're like, well, we don't have any creative people. It's like, wait, do they have space to be creative? Like, do they have any opportunities to be creative? Because so often I'll have an idea of an experiment in the back of my head. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to bias this team yet. I want to see what they come up with. If they can't come up with anything, I can give numerous examples for other companies I've worked with and different ways to approach this. And I think it's one of the reasons people bring me in, because I've seen so many different types of experiments.
Right.
And yet the teams sometimes come up with things. It's like, oh, wow, I never would have dreamed of doing it that way. But I want to go try that and see what we can learn from this. Like, what's the outcome, Not so much the output. Usually our experiments aren't going to scale. Like, even if we're doing something that's hacked together, it's never going to scale. But if we can learn what we need to learn from doing this, I think it's very exciting. And so I light up a little bit, because people, they're like, I'm a coach, right? So I don't get too high or too low. And people are just sort of like, oh my gosh, like, you don't let us get too depressed when it doesn't work. You don't let us get too high when it does, and let us invest millions of dollars into it. But it's really fun to see the teams use their creativity in that type of realm where they're trying to do an experiment and, they finally find this really creative way to learn what they need to learn.
Well, and the number of times, so we almost always talk with leadership after a design sprint to kind of give them an evaluation of the team. Like, here's how they did. We saw this person really stepped up. This person was way more creative than maybe you thought. But the number of times we hear leaders go, oh my God, I never knew David was so creative. Like, where did that come from? Like, it always seems to be a surprise. So your point about, did you actually give them space to be creative? Like, that's really, a good point to make. How often are organizations, space may even be the wrong word, how often are organizations giving people permission to be creative? And I think that comes in a lot of forms. One of the reasons I think people should always hire an experienced facilitator for a design sprint or something similar, like some sort of design thinking workshop, is we're going to do a lot of things, from icebreakers to little points in the room to the way the room's structured, to help make sure everyone can be creative. And I think that's where that surprise comes from. They've never created the environment and given the permission for that person to be creative. And when they did, they realized they have way more to contribute than they ever thought. So I think bringing someone who knows how to do that is really powerful. And it's a great way to not only train people, but to demonstrate what's possible. The other part of it is, we always say, bring in a facilitator, because 9 times out of 10, you want to participate, not facilitate. It's really hard to do both. And what we've also seen is a lot of people who are in the design world, the strategy world, who run these workshops within the organizations. We come in and we run one, and that person participates, and all of a sudden the level of contribution spikes. And it's another surprise. It's like, wow, they've been running these workshops for so long. I didn't realize how much they had to contribute. It's like, well, yeah, because it's really hard to run a workshop and also contribute. And typically the people you have in your organization running the workshop are some of your most creative and some of your most motivated. So it's probably a good idea to give them a little bit of a break and a chance and space to participate rather than facilitate.
I agree with that. I also think if people report up to you and you're facilitating, that also, depending on the culture of the company, could change things.
I would say regardless of the culture of the company, like there's a natural human instinct to some extent that if your boss is running the meeting, your perspective shifts. You can't help it, I don't think.
So I want to talk about design sprints a little bit before we wrap up. So I think I don't get ratioed often online, but I do, for someone named Bland, I have a lot of spicy takes. And one of my spicy takes was, if you do a design sprint without the customer, then you just did an art sprint. And it didn't go over well. And I understand why. And I think I knew what I was doing when I typed that out. What is your take on design sprints and including the customer? I think people view design sprints as almost like this is a silver bullet to solve for everything. We'll just do a design sprint our way through all this. Like, what's your take on design sprints at current time? Like when you're working with the team and you're trying to understand the value and explain the value that design sprint can deliver, like how do you approach that?
My non-bland take on that would be if there's no customer involved, it's not a design sprint, period. I don't know what it is. It could be any number of things, but it's not a design sprint. Like if you go back to, I'm blanking on their names, the guys from Google Ventures that wrote the book Sprint.
Oh yeah, Jake Knapp. And
yeah, there you go.
I forget. Yeah. Yes, I do. I'm aware of that book, yeah.
Yeah, I would be amazed if you weren't. You go back to that, like that is the core of the design sprint, right? The insights from the customers at the beginning and the testing with the customers at the end. I think your customers that you interview help you understand your constraints better than you ever could otherwise. If you don't talk to the customers, the only constraints you're really considering end up being business constraints, not customer constraints. And then, empathy building, like if you haven't talked to the customer and heard them talk about the problem they're having, the pain it causes, and the value of a solution to them, you will always struggle to build empathy with that customer. And then if you flip to the end of that design sprint where you're testing a prototype with your customers, that is an experience everyone should have. Because the best facial expressions you will ever see, probably, I should caveat that some, is watching a team watch a customer try and use their prototype without direction. You will see confusion, you will see outrage, you will see shock, you will see the full range of human emotion as that customer tries to figure out what they're supposed to do and how. It's hilarious from a facilitator standpoint, but from a participant standpoint, I think that may be one of the most valuable lessons they walk away from a design sprint with. They went into those prototype testing moments sure that they had designed something intuitive, easy to use. And they walk out of it realizing that's a lot harder than anyone thought. So if you don't have the customer there, the value of a design sprint is like 20% of what it could be. Because the value is in the feedback, the value is in the input. Otherwise, it's an echo chamber rather than a feedback cycle. So yeah, I would say anytime I talk to an organization like, yeah, we do a lot of design thinking stuff. I'm like, okay, how often does the team talk to customers? Well, no, we have the survey over here. Or this one person did the interviews and then we brought them in. And like, then you missed the point, right? The point is to connect the team to the customer. One of my favorite things to do is not only have the customer interviews and the customer testing at the end, but to find an influential customer to bring in and participate in the design sprint with the team. That is the most powerful thing ever. It tells such a great story. And if you pick the right customer, it sets you up for success before you have anything built. So anyone who tells me that they don't want to involve customers, that at that point, I kind of know that it's probably not really worth our time because we're not going to get the value that we should. And there's someone else out there that's willing to bring a customer in that we can knock it out to the park with.
I appreciate your take on that. I think some of the good workshops I've experienced where we literally design them in a way where the customers are coming in at lunch, and obviously there's some work to be done there because you have to pre-screen and you have to like line up. Sometimes I just throw people out on the street if they can get the customers that way, but not every, especially my
Depends
B2B
on the
clients.
product.
Yeah. So I do think it just shortens that feedback loop, of, we're not, we've already fallen in love with our solution by lunchtime, but then our dreams get crushed over lunch. And therefore we can iterate through, after that.
Well, I mean, so we always tell our clients, you need a team that can run with the product or the solution as soon as the design sprint is done. And the reason is because that moment of watching customers test the prototype is so information rich that if you wait a couple weeks, you lose a lot. No matter how good of notes you take, you lose so much of the insight and so much of the value before you have a chance to put pen to paper, fingers to keyboard, whatever it is. It's just critical. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about momentum, right? If you lose the momentum, so much falls off that it's hard to get back.
Yeah, I agree. It's coming back to momentum and leadership. And can we use words that the customers understand or our customers understand, even inside the company understand? I loved your approach to marketing. We do have to do some marketing inside the companies to help people understand the value of what we're doing in storytelling. And I can even remember recently, I gave this keynote and there was this great slide at the end and I was showing it to people and I thought, I'm going to show this slide to people and they're going to be blown away. And people were just overwhelmed by the slide. Like I had to tell a story on top of that for people to really understand the narrative. So I just want to thank you so much for hanging out with us, talking about design sprints and innovation, how you include leadership into your work and make sure that they're on board and they're reinforcing these principles and values with the teams. If people want to reach out to you and they heard something that they need help with and they want to invite you in or just talk with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
There's two really good ways. One is LinkedIn, JL Heather. That I was an early adopter of LinkedIn and got my name pretty much as is. So that helps a lot. So JL Heather on LinkedIn. And then the other is our website, centered.work. So CENTERED.work. We'd love to talk to you. The best way to do it is to schedule a strategy session, a quick call. One of our big goals is to never do a hard sell. And with every client, we start off with a 1 to 3 hour workshop that's for free that lets us decide, hey, is this something where there's potential? Is this a right fit for us? Is this a right fit for the organization that has contacted us? And if the answer is yes to all of that, that's when we move forward. And we think it's really important to have that upfront kind of workshop time just to make sure everyone's on board and everyone understands where we're going. So there's no pressure. We try and invest in our partnerships before they become official. And we'd love to talk to people.
Well, if you are listening and you want to reach out to JL, go through LinkedIn or the center.work. We will put those on our detail page as well, so people can find those. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. I really appreciate the conversation and geeking out over how to make innovation stick. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for listening to another episode of How I Tested That, where we share stories about experimentation, tips, and tricks. If you learned something new, please recommend us to a friend or colleague. And remember, keep testing your ideas.